Welcome to Understanding Islam, bearers of the final message. This week we're going to look at the art of Islam. Think about beauty. Can you imagine any human being who cannot appreciate something beautiful? It could be beautiful words or music or the flight of a bird. It could be a painting, color, a sunset. There is something about beauty that speaks to the very depth of the human being. It's not just an experience on the eye, it's also an experience in our hearts. And for Islam, beauty is part of a spiritual relationship with God, because God is beautiful and God loves beauty. And so beauty actually speaks to the innermost depth of the human being, to our spirit. The difficulty with anything that speaks to our spirit is, who's in charge? Where's it leading us? Where's it going? We have another saying in English that all that glitters is not gold. So there are some things that actually affect our spirits, some things which look as though they're beautiful, but actually they take us off in another direction. And so we always need to be aware that something which is beautiful needs to be leading us and directing us toward God. And so there has to be a critical appraisal of all things to do with art. They should be godly and not distracting us, not taking us away from the life, the will, the works of God. Now, if we think about Mecca at the time of the Prophet, it was a time of idol worship. In Mecca, there were many different idols cut of stone and wood, sometimes just blocks of stone. People would worship them instead of worshipping God. And the criteria, the hallmark, are you a Muslim or not? Do you worship God or do you worship those idols? So not surprisingly, the first prohibition in Islam when it comes to artistic work is that there should be no images of anything that people could worship instead of the worship of God. And so there's no statuary, no idols, no carved images in Islam, so that nobody will worship them instead of worshipping God. So this actually gives us our first definition of the art of Islam. It is that art that reinforces and leads us toward absolute submission to God alone and to nothing else. It is an expression of the pure monotheism of Islam. But again, going back to the early period, the Prophet isn't born into a vacuum, onto a blank page of history. Instead, he is born into a certain culture, a certain society. And as Islam expands away from Mecca and Medina, it begins to encounter other sorts of cultures, other sorts of ways of life. Different places around the world come under the influence of Muslims and of Islam. And so the first gesture then of Islam in relation to art is one of purification. We should not permit those things which do not accord with an Islamic way of life, like idol worship, for example. After purification comes adaptation. That is, that you should take those things from those other cultures around the world and you should embrace them and use them to promote an Islamic way of life, so that we can say that Islamic art is that art which furthers a Muslim worldview, which promotes an Islamic understanding of what it is to be a human being, to live in a created society, to live under God. And so different forms of art are brought under the umbrella of Islam and are further directed toward the service of God. And so then we can begin to see the development of particular Islamic art forms. The first element that we're going to look at is visual art, paintings, drawings, pictures. Now, these are normally pictures of human beings or animals, and such like animate objects are not generally permitted within the Islamic tradition, because those are the things that historically people tend to worship instead of the worship of God. And so we can start with a general wariness, a general prohibition of the representation of animate objects, especially in the mosque, although sometimes these animate objects are represented in other places. Anything that has a soul is an animate object, and therefore we think normally of humans and of animals. But the representation of vegetable material or of geometrical patterns, for example, were part of that which was incorporated into Islam. There isn't a direct citation in the Quran that prohibits all forms of visual art, but there are hadith that strongly warn against them, that strongly caution Muslims to avoid such things. So the best known of these hadith is when the Prophet says that the angels will never enter into a house in which there are visual images of living things, living beings, living animals or humans, especially not a dog. And so we have direct guidance from the Prophet on this question. Now, sometimes these kind of images were used in public places, in palaces, in bathhouses, in places of rest and relaxation, and sometimes in people's homes. Almost without exception, never in a mosque itself. And sometimes we see images of animals with their heads cut off, and in that way it's a sign that this is not an object that you should worship. Now, with the coming of photography, then a whole new discussion enters into the picture. And different Muslim scholars and schools will take different positions regarding photographs. Some will say that there should be no photographs of human beings or of animals. Others will say they can be in the home, but they shouldn't be in the room in which prayers are offered. Some will say, well, yes, if they're in that room and you're going to pray in there, then you should turn them face down before you begin your prayer as a sign that these are not things that you worship. And again, others will say, well, they should not be in the direction of prayer, the Qibla. This is based upon a tradition, an account from the life of the Prophet, in which in the home of one of his wives there was a wall hanging that was richly decorated. And it was on the wall that was in the direction of prayer. And the Prophet asked her to move it because, he said, it distracted him in his prayer. And so this idea of having nothing in the direction of prayer is very important. If we go into mosques, for example, the Qibla wall, the direction of prayer, is normally a plain blank wall, so that nothing should distract the worshipper from the worship of God. Now, when television came along, we had yet another interesting discussion amongst the scholars, and most of them resolved it by saying that with television you have no enduring image. As soon as you turn the television set off, the image is gone. It's only an instantaneous array of flickering lights that gives us the image on the television, and therefore they said that television pictures were generally permitted. Indeed, today there's a live stream over the internet from the sacred mosque with people around the Kaaba in Mecca, and also from the Prophet's mosque in Medina. You will notice that one of the characteristics of many buildings in Muslim lands is that they are richly decorated with tile work, or with embossing, or with painting. Now, the first building that was decorated as an Islamic building was in fact in Jerusalem. It was the Dome of the Rock that was finished in the year 691, and it was decorated on its inner surfaces with verses of the Quran that were done in beautiful writing, calligraphy we can say. And this work was actually done by Christian craftsmen, because they were the best people at that time who used to have this skill before the Muslims took it on for themselves. This gives us an important principle that the art of Islam is not necessarily only done by Muslims. It can be done by other people too. So it is Islamically inspired art rather than always art that is executed by Muslims. Now, calligraphy gives us a very important element in Islamic decoration. Once the Muslims encountered Greek geometry in Baghdad and Basra from the 8th century onwards, then the idea of geometrical patterns, of geometrical tessellation, shapes that fit together, of replication so that one image is repeated over and over again, and of symmetry so that images are balanced one against the other. These elements enter very strongly into the art of Islam. The principle is one of abstraction. You see, much of art around the world actually is to engage the person with the object which is being illustrated. But the art of Islam goes in another direction. It moves to abstraction. That is, it doesn't engage the person and tie them up with the material object, but rather it liberates the spirit so that the spirit is abstracted from the art and is elevated into a relationship with God. We often use the term arabesque. Arabesque, the art of Islam for decoration, comprises geometrical pattern work, beautiful calligraphy, and often vegetable forms. And when we see these vegetable forms, we get there strongly the principle of abstraction. Because the artist is not trying to replicate the exact form of that particular leaf or plant, rather the form is abstracted and can then be replicated, can be used symmetrically, geometrically, and so on. In the 13th century, in particular cultures within the Muslim world, and we think here of Persia and of Turkey and of India, it became common to have paintings of human beings, men and women, always with respect, but nevertheless human representation. Even sometimes we find that there were representation of prophets and of angels. But the idea of respect and also of abstraction was made clear because the actual face of the prophet or of the angel was obliterated. It was painted instead as a blank oval to remind us that this wasn't a visual representation that could in any way be worshipped. When it comes to Islamic architecture, there are certain elements which have become associated with Islam. The first is the minaret. Now we know that in the time of the Prophet himself, those who were going to call people to prayer merely rose to the roof of the highest building around and called. But already by the year 666 in Basra, we see a purpose-built tower which was used to raise the speaker so that the call to prayer could be heard over a wider distance. And then over the centuries and in different cultures, we find square minarets, cylinders, towers, polygons. We find them spiral outside staircases, as in some places in Egypt. We find them with pagoda-shaped roofs, as in China, so that the minaret becomes an almost ubiquitous symbol alongside the mosque so that people can be called to prayer. In the Prophet's mosque in Medina, which was a very simple building in his time, but has been built and rebuilt over and over again in Islamic history, until now it's an absolutely vast building of great beauty and proportion. But if you go right back to the earliest days, it was in the Prophet's mosque in the year 710 that we find the first mihrab being built. The mihrab as an archway, a niche, cut into the wall of the direction of prayer, the Qibla, so that everybody would know in which direction they were to pray, and also it was a place for the Imam to stand. Now, if you think about it, when you go into the mosque, the Qibla wall is right in your line of sight, and therefore the mihrab is a particular visual focus. And so over the centuries in different cultures around the Muslim world, the mihrab has been an element of the mosque that has been particularly enriched and particularly beautified so that it elevates the thoughts, the spirits of the believers when they assemble for worship. Another element that becomes very common in the architecture of Islam is the dome. The first dome, of course, is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, but domes have taken various shapes in different cultures around the world. Onion-shaped domes, bulbous ones, hemispheres, some that are pointed, many different shapes of domes. Now, the good thing about a dome is that it's practical. First of all, it enables you to have a volume of air above the congregation, and that cools them and also gives them fresh air to breathe when the mosque is very full. Secondly, it acts as a sounding board, so that the voice of the Imam is enhanced and intensified so that it can be better heard. And thirdly, a dome is the best way to cover a large expanse without a lot of pillars, so that people can form one single congregation and also see and hear what's going on. But the dome is not just practical, it's also symbolic. It is symbolic of the vast expanse of the desert. You can imagine if you're standing in the desert, the horizon goes from one side to the other, and so the dome actually symbolizes that. It symbolizes the infinitude of God, and therefore it raises the thoughts, the hearts of people again to think about the majesty of God, the Creator, the Sustainer. Domes are not only used on mosques, but they're used on other Muslim buildings as well, mausolea, for example, which are built over the burial place of someone. Now, with the dome, we think about the light that floods into a mosque. Because the Quran tells us that God is light, and the symbolism of light is used a lot in relationship with God. And therefore Islamic architecture liked to flood mosques and other buildings with light. In order to do that, were needed to develop arches. First of all, the simple round arch, and then the horseshoe arch, and then into pointed arches, and then we find two-tier pointed arches, where one row is above another, thus elevating the walls, giving more light, more space, and making it visually a very beautiful, a symmetrical place. This idea of symmetry is crucially important, not only internally, with the balancing of arches and of light, but also externally. If you look at the Taj Mahal, for example, in India, there is the Taj itself, which is a burial place, it's a mausoleum, but then each side of it, it's balanced by two other buildings. One is a mosque facing in the direction of Mecca, and the other is a zikr hall, a hall where people met for remembrance of God. But the two buildings balance the Taj and make it, in this sense, a work of extreme architectural beauty. Indeed, the Taj Mahal in India, the Alhambra Palace in Granada in Spain, surely these would be in the top of the list of anybody's list of beautiful buildings in the world. The art of Islam can be very practical as well. Think about all those things that you need around the house: cups, plates, bowls, dishes, jugs. All those objects were brought into Islamic art and culture from Persia, from China, from Byzantium, and then they were given a special Islamic style with decorations of arabesque, of vegetable forms, and also in terms of plaques on the wall, for example, beautiful calligraphy as well. And so all sorts of objects became part of Islamic art, not just in ceramics, but also in metalwork, in gold and in silver, in glass and in crystal, in ivory, so that the art of Islam became a very wide embracing culture. In terms of verbal art, poetry has always had a particular place within Muslim life and culture. Now we know that there were some poets in the time of the Prophet who used to recite very bad poetry, satirical poetry, poetry that poured vitriol on other people, and he disliked this very strongly. And so poetry must always be that which uplifts the spirit and raises our imagination toward the divine world. So therefore poetry has always been important amongst the mystics of Islam, the Sufis, who have used poetry to try to express their yearning for closeness with God. Music is another element. Music sometimes gets a bad press in the world of Islam because of the things with which music is associated. Music was associated with drinking, with illicit sexual activities and such like, and therefore it should not be allowed to take people away from the true path of Islam. So some Muslim scholars will be very much opposed to music in all its forms. Others will say that where music is used, it must be under strict control. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, we often say, music moves my spirits, it sends me, it takes me to another place. Well, where's it taking you? Who's in control? This is why Islam always says that music can only be used within the strict control of Islamic principles, of Islamic supervision. And we see music then being used in particular within the Sufi tradition, under the direction of a Sufi sheikh, where the music is used to actually lift the spirits of the believer and help one to seek a closer union with God. And the musical instruments that are used are normally very simple. The single-sided daf, for example, the drum that would give a simple rhythm, and the ney, the end-blown reed flute, which gives that particular sound, which the great Sufi poet Rumi says it actually engages the very heart of the human being. There are other forms of melody which are used within the world of Islam. If you listen to the azan being called, for example, often you get certain sounds that are elongated, which make it penetrate, which make it reach through to the heart of the believer to draw them to prayer. If you listen to Quran recitation, certain sounds again are modulated, certain sounds are elongated, so that the sound itself penetrates through to the heart of the believer, not just something which is heard in terms of the content, the words. And then nasheeds, songs in praise of the Prophet. These are quite widely sung without accompaniment in different Muslim cultures around the world. Al-Ghazali and the Sufis in general often say that there are two elements to beauty. There's the outer element, in which the sound is taken through the ears, and all human beings are capable of that. But then there's another element, the inner beauty of the sound, and that is the sound as it penetrates to the human heart, and that requires the believing heart fully to appreciate that inner beauty. Dance hasn't formed a very large part of the artistic expression of Islam. We know that in the time of the prophets, the children danced and he approved, and we know also that he watched upon occasion African warriors performing their dances. But dancing in general has not been a very public element of the art of Islam. There has been dancing in single-sex groups in private, women dancing together, for example, in their own quarters. And of course, dance is also used by some Sufi traditions in which you have rhythmic movement to elevate the soul to engage with God. So there we have the art of Islam, perhaps the single highest pinnacle of the art of Islam is calligraphy, the beautiful way in which the words are written. And what are these words? These are the very word of God from the Quran itself, which are read in ways with lines, with curves, with slopes, which actually engage the human heart and allow it to take flight in communion with God. Calligraphy sometimes is spoken of as visual zikr. Ticker, the prayer of the heart, the prayer of the remembrance of God, and calligraphy, visual ticker. Join me again next week when we're going to be looking at the contemporary world of Muslims and Islam. I look forward to seeing you then.